Good day. I've been asked to continue our series on the worst week ever. Today we're going to look at Judas hanging himself. I'm going to try not to go long. I'm known for it, so I'll try not to. I apologize if I do. So I've got several different Bibles in front of me. I'm going to read from various Bibles, different translations of it, some more direct than others. But let's get right down to it. I'm going to be reading from Matthew 27, 1 through 10. When daybreak came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. After tying him up, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was full of remorse and returned the 20 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood," he said. "What's that to us?" they said. "See to it yourself." So he threw the silver into the sanctuary and departed. Then he went and hanged himself. The chief priests took the silver and said, "It is not lawful to put it in the temple treasury, since it is blood money." So they conferred together and bought the potter's field with it as a burial place for foreigners. Therefore, that field has been called Blood Field to this day. Then what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. They took 20 pieces of silver, the price of him whose price was set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Okay, there's a lot in here as I've done my research that I've come across. Some of it's common stuff, some of it strange thoughts ran through my brain as I was doing this. I looked it up. I've got a Holman Christian study Bible in front of me. I've got an archaeological study Bible in front of me. My Holman is an apologetics Bible. And I've got a complete Jewish Bible that's a direct translation from Hebrew into English. So like I said, I have a variety of different sources here. I also used Strong's Concordance to look some stuff up, to make sure I hadn't overlooked something interesting. So let's get down to it. I'm gonna start with verse 3, because the first two verses are talking about them handing Jesus over to Pilate after he'd been found guilty and they had plotted against him. So it says in verse 3, "Then Judas the betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was full of remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders." Okay, there's a lot in that one verse. First of all, it says Judas, when he saw that he was condemned. Okay, he should have kind of expected it, but it may not have been what he thought. It may have filled him with terror. The Strongs that I looked up brought up a point that I'd heard several times, so I'm going to bring it up, and hopefully, it's an idea. It kind of might explain some of the actions. It said in Strong's, it says, "But perhaps this unhappy man expected that while he got the bribe, the Lord would miraculously escape, as he had once and again done before, out of the enemy's power. And if so, his remorse would have come upon him with all the greater keenness." Most of the people that were looking for the Messiah back then, and a lot of them still do, thought that he was going to overthrow the earthly kingdoms. They thought he was going to come in and take over and push Rome out of Israel. So, that may have been Judas's motivation to push Jesus into revealing himself as the Messiah and to take over and drive the Romans out. By selling him out to the chief priest, he thought that Jesus would show his power in the way that everybody thought the Messiah would come in as the great conqueror. So that may have led to his remorse when he saw Jesus betrayed. I also thought about this. It says, when daybreak came and he saw this. Okay, so Judas, seeing that, did Judas follow him? Did Judas go into the chief priest's house where they had all met when they had came together to judge Jesus? Because Peter followed him to the gates, it said. Did Judas go in with the guards? Just a thought I had, something to think about. Okay, it said that in verse 3 that he returned the 30 pieces of silver. Okay, 30 pieces of silver kept going through my head, kept going through my head. So finally, I went searching for it. The only place I found 30 pieces of silver mentioned specifically was in Exodus 21:32. I thought I had it open to Exodus 21:32, but I don't have a Bible open to that for all of them that I have in front of me. But Exodus 21:32 it says, if the ox gores a male or female slave, then the owner of the ox has to pay 30 shekels for the slave, and the ox must be stoned. I was thinking about this, and I had a weird thought run through my head, but that's the one time that 30 shekels are specifically listed. 30 shekels was the cost to buy a slave. That's why it kept going through my head. So they basically bought Jesus as a slave. Judas was being the slave trader. He sold Jesus into slavery. I have another thought with that, but I'll get back to that in a little bit. I want to make sure I cover what I need to cover first, because I don't want to go any longer than necessary here. Okay, so verse 4, I have sinned and betrayed innocent blood, he said. Normally, that kind of thing, unless you were taking your sacrifice to the priest, you could be stoned for that. That was a killable offense. They could execute you for betraying innocent blood. That was in the Old Testament. So, the fact that he came to the priest and he admitted to it, and they're like, so what's it to us? They didn't care. That's how deep into their plot to kill Jesus they were. They did not care that he had betrayed innocent blood. They knew that it was against the law, but they did it anyway. Okay, I'm trying to keep track of my notes here so I don't go someplace I didn't want to go with it. And okay, like I said, they said, so what's it to us? They didn't care if he was guilty or innocent, and they told Judas to be gone. In other words, we don't even want to see you. Just get out of our sight. I've never gotten to that point where I've just been like, get out of my sight to somebody that wanted to deal with me, but I can understand, Judas is the reminder of their guilt, much as the money is a reminder to Judas of his guilt. Which is why it says he threw the silver into the sanctuary and departed. Some versions say he threw it into the potter of the Lord's house. I actually found a reference in one of the things I was looking at that has the word yotzer, Y-O-T-Z-E-R. It's a Hebrew word that means treasury. It's translated 2 different times in the Bible. One time as treasury and one as potter. So he threw it into the potter's area in the temple. He threw it into the treasury of the temple. Here it says sanctuary. It can be translated either way. I thought that was kind of interesting, the way this verse loops back around to that. Honestly, I was like it says in Strong's, it says that he was the money bothered him to even have it. It was such a bad thing. He didn't even want to have it in his possession. That's why he threw it back at the priests. It also says he threw it into the sanctuary. That's an area where only the priest could go. So did the priest tell him to be gone and then turn and walk off and go in an area where he couldn't go because the temple guards would stop him? So he threw the money in after them. He wanted it out of his possession that much. The guy who had spent all his time trying to get his hands in the money and wanted the money suddenly didn't want that money. He didn't want that blood money. So I'm moving on, because I'm looking down, I'm seeing things I want to remember. It says, then he threw the silver into the sanctuary and departed, and then went and hanged himself. Okay, Mark's version says that he fell and hit his head and his intestines were spilled. I've heard some thoughts that, did he not tie the noose right? Was he hanging someplace and the noose broke? Was the limb broke that he was tied to, and he fell and hit his head and his guts burst open? Not to be gross. And that's about as much as I'm going to go into the hanging. I'm going to skip the science teacher explanation because hanging can be very painful because of lack of oxygen. But I'm not going into the details of that. Let's see, verse 6. Chief priest took the silver and said, it is not lawful to put it into the temple treasury since it is blood money. Okay, the word Corbin comes up. The Corbin, or the chest containing the money dedicated for sacred purposes. They couldn't put it in the money dedicated for sacred purposes. The only other time I've run across the term Corbin is when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and he makes the comment about the money that was supposed to be used to take care of parents, and a priest would say, instead of giving it to the parents, it is now Corbin. It is dedicated for sacred things in the temple. That's how they got around taking care of their parents. They could say, I'm being more lofty. I'm giving it to the temple instead of doing what the Bible says and honoring your parents. Let's see, number 7. So they conferred together and bought the potter's field with it as a burial place for foreigners. Therefore, that field has been called Blood Field to this day. Then what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him whose price was set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Okay, so there's a lot there to talk about. It says okay, I'm going to go with thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around because my brain is doing that right now. They bought the potter's field. My first thought is, is the potter's field, are we taking it like the Yatzer, and they're basically saying the temple's field or the treasury's field where they bought to bury the foreigners? Next thought was, is this the field where Judas fell? So the blood was there. I don't know on this one. But the thing that I came across that was most interesting is it says that then what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. I have a reference that says it's an allusion to Jeremiah, but most of that is actually Zechariah. And it references back to Zechariah 11. Why did my Bible turn to 11? Oh, well, Zechariah 11, 12, and 13, sorry. The Jeremiah reference I'll come back to here in a second, but I'm going to read you the Zechariah reference from my Hebrew Bible. I'm going to start with verse 10 and read through 13. I took my staff, Noam, and snapped it in two, in order to break my covenant which I had made with all the people. On that day when it was broken, the most miserable of the sheep who paid attention to me knew that this was indeed a message from Adonai. I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages. If not, don't. So they weighed out to me my wages, 30 silver shekels, that is 12 ounces. Concerning this princely sum at which they valued me, Adonai said, throw it into the treasury. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the treasury in the house of Adonai. This is where I actually ran across the reference to the potter. It says throwing it into the potter of the house of God. This is where the whole potter's field comes circular back to where it says God told me to buy the potter's field. Also goes back to Jeremiah 19 and where it talks about buying a clay pot from the potter, and then he takes the elders and some of the people from Jerusalem and takes them up to Topheth in the valley of Hinnom. And he says that the Lord has condemned them, and that he said this place will be filled with the blood of the innocent. And he goes on to say that he's going to turn Topheth in the valley of Hinnom into a valley of slaughter. They're going to call it the valley of slaughter. Makes me wonder if this is all the same place, because that would make it interesting if the pot from Jeremiah 19, the potter's, where he breaks the pot, is where they now have the potter's field that is being sold to be the field of blood. So, that was kind of interesting to me. Also references back to Jeremiah 32, where Jeremiah is told to buy the field of his relative, that he was the redeemer of the field. So, there was kind of that interesting focus there also. And the fact that it was Zechariah more than Jeremiah, but Jeremiah was the first one listed in the prophets. So it may have been that he was just attributing it to Jeremiah because Jeremiah was the first name in the prophets, and it was from the prophets. So, that's one of those weird things. Now, I'm going to come back to that whole 30 shekels goring reference as something to leave you to think about. Exodus 32:24. That's where Aaron has built the golden calf as Israel is leaving Egypt. Moses is on the mountain and he's getting the 10 Commandments, and Aaron is there asking for something to worship, and Aaron builds a golden calf. So is it a calf of an oxen? If so, that represented the priestly apostasy and following other gods. So if the golden calf grew up to be an oxen, and they paid Judas 30 shekels for the oxen goring the slave, do they pay 30 shekels for the oxen who's gored this slave of God? Jesus being the slave of God in this case? So, to me that was kind of interesting. It all came circular, that the slave who was sold for 30 shekels as a slave to the priests who were trying to save themselves, basically, who were doing something disreputable and kind of would have been in the apostasy like Aaron was when he made the golden calf, and how Israel was. It's also a reference, and I'm trying to remember, the one where it talks about the lowest, meekest sheep. The one I read were out of the Jewish Bible. It says the most miserable of the sheep who paid attention to him, paid him. Most miserable of the sheep. Could that be a reference to the priests also who were not living the way they were supposed to be? They were miserable sheep, where Jesus is always called the shepherd, were the priests the miserable sheep. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with that. Have a good rest of the day. I hope to see you on Sunday.